My name is Rachel Monroe, and that night, after a 14-hour shift at the hospital, I walked into the living room and froze when I saw my suitcase sitting right by the door with a cold handwritten note. "Your room is Alex's now." Alex, my sister's 8-month-old son, had just moved in, and overnight, my daughter and I had been pushed to the sidelines in the very house I once thought was our safe haven. Have you ever felt like you were cast out of your own family, just because someone else was considered more important? If this story resonates with you, leave a comment, share it, and follow along with me on this journey, because what happened next was beyond anything I could have imagined. I stood still beside the suitcase, the house keys still in my hand. My heart pounded, not just from exhaustion after a long day, but from the familiar ache of an old wound rushing back. Sophie, my daughter, came running from her room, clutching her worn-out teddy bear. She looked up at me, confusion in her eyes, as if trying to figure out what was happening. "What's going on, Mom?" Sophie asked, her voice so soft I had to lean down to hear her. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my tone steady. "It's okay, honey. Your grandparents just want to switch rooms a little." But deep down, I knew this wasn't just switching rooms. This was the start of a chain of changes I'd always feared. 3 years earlier, when my marriage fell apart, I was left with almost nothing. My ex-husband, Michael, and I had been together for 12 years, building a family I thought would last. Michael was a software engineer with a steady income, while I worked as a pediatric nurse, arranging my shifts so I could spend more time with Sophie. The divorce meant I only received minimal child support and shared custody. In those first months after the divorce, I was drowning in bills and sleepless nights. When my parents, the Monroes, offered, "Come live with us for a while, ease the burden, save up for a house later," I took it as a lifeline. I remember that first night moving in, my dad, David, patted my shoulder. "You'll always have a place here, sweetheart." My mom, Linda, nodded beside him. "As long as you and Sophie keep things tidy, everything will be fine." But fine had never really described my relationship with them. Growing up, I was the responsible child, always doing what my parents expected, while my younger sister, Madison, was endlessly indulged. Madison dropped out of college after her first year, hopped from job to job without sticking to any. Yet whenever she hit a rough patch, my parents welcomed her back with open arms. I, on the other hand, had to push through every obstacle on my own. I spent 8 years working and studying to become a pediatric nurse, taking extra night shifts in the ER, never daring to ask my parents for a dime. And yet, I never felt their pride, only the unspoken comparisons to my beautiful, charming sister. When Sophie and I moved in, my parents converted their home office into a bedroom for her, while I stayed in the guest room. I was grateful Sophie had her own space. We quickly adapted to my parents' routine. I chipped in for groceries, handled most of the cooking and cleaning, and made sure Sophie respected their rules. Everything changed when Madison divorced and moved back with Alex, her 8-month-old baby boy. The day Madison walked through the door, my mom rushed to hug her, tears in her eyes. "You've been through so much. Come home to me and I'll take care of you and Alex." My dad scooped Alex up and turned to Sophie and me, the first grandson in our family. His voice was full of pride, the kind I had never once heard directed toward Sophie. From there, things shifted so fast I could barely keep up. The dining room was rearranged into a play area for Alex. A brand new high chair, almost $500, appeared by the table, even though just a week earlier, my mom had frowned when I bought better asthma medication for Sophie. Sophie's activities were increasingly restricted. She loved practicing piano in the afternoons, but Madison would say, "Tell her to play softer." Alex just fell asleep. Days when my parents promised to pick Sophie up from school for me, they'd cancel because Madison needs to take Alex to the doctor or Alex is fussy, we have to stay home. One night, after a draining shift, I came home to find Sophie curled up on the couch. She whispered, "Grandma said I shouldn't make noise because Alex is the only grandson in the family." My chest tightened. I tried to reason with myself, telling Sophie that everyone was just distracted with a new baby. I reminded her how happy everyone had been when she was born, but her eyes told me she already felt the difference. Then came tonight, the suitcase by the door, the cold note. It crushed the last sliver of hope I'd been holding on to. I stood there, taking a deep breath. Madison was in the kitchen preparing dinner for Alex. My mom sat at the table cutting fruit. I walked in, forcing calm into my voice. "I want to talk about this note." My mom looked up, surprise mingled with mild irritation. "Oh, that. Madison and Alex need a bigger room. You're an adult, you can stay in the basement for a while." "The basement is damp and cold, you know that," I replied. "Sophie has asthma, she can't be down there," Madison chimed in, her voice light but laced with mockery. "You always make everything complicated. When I was little, I slept on the couch for months. It didn't kill me." I met her gaze. "You didn't have a child with a respiratory illness." My dad came in from the living room, ending the argument with a firm statement. "The decision's been made. Alex is a baby, he needs space and quiet. Sophie's in school all day, you're at work, so the basement won't be an issue." It felt like my role as a mother had just been stripped away in my own home. Sophie slipped her hand into mine, small, warm, but trembling. In that moment, I knew everything stood on a fragile line. I could stay silent and accept the injustice, or I could find another way to protect my daughter and myself from a cycle I'd been trapped in my entire life. I gave Sophie's hand a reassuring squeeze and forced a smile. But deep inside, I knew I couldn't let this continue. And I also knew my next decision would change everything. Stay tuned, because the real shock was only beginning. I began to realize this wasn't just about a bedroom. Everything in the house was slowly shifting toward Madison and Alex, while Sophie and I were being pushed further into a corner, as if someone was quietly boxing us in. Before, the living room was where Sophie would spread out her books, and I would review patient charts on the sofa. Now, the center of the room was dominated by a giant playmat, surrounded by a walker, a bouncer, toy bins, and brand new gear for Alex. Every time I came home, Madison was there with Alex in her arms, the TV playing children's shows, taking over the space that once belonged to all of us. One afternoon, I found Sophie sitting quietly at the kitchen table, drawing. She usually loved the living room for its natural light, but today she'd tucked herself away. "Why aren't you out there, honey?" I asked softly. She pressed her lips together. "Aunt Madison said I shouldn't mess up Alex's play space." I swallowed my sigh, a wave of helplessness rising inside me. I wanted to tell her to do whatever made her happy, but I knew. One word from Madison or a disapproving look from my mom, and Sophie would quietly pack up and retreat again. A week later, after finishing my shift, I walked into the kitchen to find my mother carefully wiping down a brand new high chair. I recognized it immediately. It was the kind of expensive model only well-off families usually bought, and it definitely cost no less than $500. I remembered clearly how, just a few days earlier, she had complained when I bought Sophie a better brand of asthma medication that cost only a few dozen more. "Did you buy this chair, Mom?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Yes, so it's easier for Alex to eat," my mother replied, her tone brimming with pride. "He's the only grandson in the family. We have to take good care of him." I bit my lip. That same phrase, "the only grandson," was like a constant reminder that my daughter was somehow less important simply because of her gender. The unfairness didn't stop there. My parents started canceling the times they had promised to help me pick Sophie up from school, giving reasons like Madison needs to take Alex to the doctor or Alex is tired, it's better to stay home with him. Every time it happened, I had to switch shifts or ask a coworker to pick Sophie up for me. One evening, when I came home from work, Sophie was curled up at the dining table, a bowl of noodles in front of her that had long gone cold. She whispered, "Grandma told me to eat first because she was busy feeding Alex." "Why didn't you eat with everyone else?" I asked. When I sat down, Aunt Madison said that spot was for Alex to sit in the new high chair. I sat next to her, my chest tightening. This house had once been the place I thought would make Sophie feel safe after our family fell apart. Now it was becoming a place where she had to learn to step aside and stay quiet so she wouldn't bother anyone. Another night, when Sophie and I were in our room, she gathered all her courage to ask, "Mom, do Grandma and Grandpa love Alex more than me?" I didn't know how to answer. How could I deny it when I felt the same thing every single day? But I didn't want to add to her sadness either. I pulled her into my arms. "Sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups don't realize they're hurting someone's feelings, but I'm always here, and to me, you're the most important." That sentence brought back memories of my own childhood. I had been the kid who knew I was only loved when I behaved, didn't cause trouble, and stepped aside for my special sibling. Now, I was watching the same thing happen to my daughter, and the pain was doubled. Everything came to a head one Sunday afternoon. Madison and Alex arrived almost 2 hours late for family dinner. My mother kept the food warm for them, but when Sophie and I had once been late by just 30 minutes, because I had to stay at the hospital, we were served cold leftovers. At that dinner, Sophie quietly took a few bites and set her spoon down. When Alex grabbed his food and threw it on the floor, the whole family burst into laughter. Madison even said, "He's so smart, just testing everyone's reaction." Sophie looked at me and whispered, "Why can't I do that?" I could only shake my head because there was no reasonable answer, just blatant favoritism. I began to notice Sophie withdrawing. She spoke less at home, and her teacher emailed me, concerned that she no longer participated in class as eagerly as before. At home, she often went straight to her room and closed the door. Her piano practice sessions became less frequent because Madison kept complaining the sound startled Alex. I used to think that if I tried hard enough for long enough, everyone would see and change. But clearly, the more silent I stayed, the further Sophie and I were pushed away. And by this point, I began to understand, this wasn't just a lack of fairness. It was a quiet, constant disregard, the kind that slowly erodes a person's self-worth. Do you think I kept enduring it or fought back? The answer might surprise you. One Friday evening, after a long, exhausting shift, I came home hoping only to change clothes, have dinner, and spend some time talking with Sophie. But as soon as I opened the door, I heard the scraping sound of something heavy being dragged across the wooden floor. A wave of musty dust and cold air drifted up from the basement stairs, making me freeze in place. Sophie was sitting on the edge of the stairs, clutching her teddy bear, her eyes red. Down below, my father and Madison were moving her wardrobe into the basement. My mother stood at the top of the stairs, holding a box of toys. "Mom, what is going on here?" I asked, my voice strained but still tight with control. My father looked up, as if this was perfectly reasonable. "We already discussed this. Alex needs a bigger room to be both his bedroom and Madison's workspace. Sophie will be in the basement for a while." I stepped down a few stairs, forcing myself to steady my heartbeat. "The basement is damp, musty, cold, and unsafe. She has asthma, you both know that." Madison smirked, standing beside the crib that had just been set up in Sophie's old room. "You always make everything such a big deal. I used to sleep on the couch for months when I was younger." "You don't have a child with asthma," I replied, my eyes fixed on Sophie's toy boxes mixed carelessly with dusty old storage bins. My mother cut in, her voice firm. "Kids can sleep anywhere. You're grown, you should make room for your sister. Alex is the one who needs peace and quiet." The whole room seemed to tilt. Sophie stood still on the stairs, trying to look calm but gripping her teddy bear so tightly I knew she was holding back tears. "I don't agree," I said, each word deliberate. "This directly affects Sophie's health, and I'm not going to let it happen." My father slammed the wardrobe down on the floor with a loud, sharp thud. "You're living here for free, Amanda. Don't forget that." The words cut deep. For the past 2 years, I'd been contributing to groceries, cooking, cleaning, taking care of the house, and yet, in their eyes, I was still just living off them. Sophie looked at me, worry in her eyes, as if waiting to see what I would do. I bent down and put my hand on her shoulder. Go to your room and pack the most important things. Don't worry, Mom will take care of the rest. When Sophie went upstairs, Madison looked at me, half mocking, half surprised. What are you gonna do? Leave just because of this? This isn't small, I replied, my voice cold as steel. This is my daughter, her health and her safety. My mother set the box of toys down and crossed her arms. Family means making sacrifices. I turned to her, speaking slowly. I'm willing to sacrifice, but not to make my daughter feel like she doesn't matter. The air grew thick. I knew I couldn't change their minds right then, but I also knew I had just crossed a threshold in my mind. There was no going back. Only 10 minutes later, Sophie returned with her small backpack. She carried a few clothes, her sketchbook, some colored pencils, and her teddy bear. Seeing her clutch those few belongings made my heart ache. I turned to my parents. We're leaving tonight. I'll come back tomorrow for the rest. My father frowned. Amanda, don't be foolish. You'll regret this. I've been regretting the past 2 years already, Dad, I said, then took Sophie's hand and walked out the door. Stepping out into the cold night air made me shiver, but at the same time, I felt an odd sense of relief. I didn't know exactly where we would go that night, but I knew for certain I would not let Sophie sleep in that basement, not for a single night. As we got into the car, Sophie looked at me, her voice quiet but firm. Mom, we'll be okay, right? I took her hand. We'll be okay, I promise. I started the car, turning my back on the yellow glow of the house I once called Ench home, a wave of pain and determination rising in my chest. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew one thing. This was the moment I had to stand up, not just for Sophie but for myself. Driving through the night, my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, partly to stay calm and partly to reassure myself that I was doing the right thing. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, quietly staring out the window. The pale yellow streetlights fell across her face, and I could see her long lashes trembling with each breath. I took her to a small diner that was still open. We slid into the farthest booth, the quietest spot in the place. When the server left after taking our order, Sophie looked at me and asked softly, Mom, where will we sleep tonight? I smiled, trying to hide the worry churning inside me. Maybe I'll call Aunt Laura. Do you remember her? She came over last Christmas. Sophie nodded, her eyes showing a little less worry. I knew I had to give her a sense of security right now, even though my own head was full of unanswered questions. When the food arrived, I discreetly pulled out my phone and texted Laura, emergency. Can Sophie and I stay at your place for a few days? Less than 5 minutes later, Laura called back, her voice filled with concern. Amanda, what's going on? I took a deep breath and gave her the short version of what had just happened. Laura was silent for a moment, then said firmly, Bring Sophie here right now. I've got a spare room and an extra bed. It's no problem at all. I almost wanted to cry with relief. After we finished eating, I drove Sophie to Laura's place. Her warm, cozy 2-story home was lit up, as if waiting for us. Laura opened the door and hugged me tightly. Come inside, both of you. We'll talk later, just rest tonight. Sophie was immediately taken with Laura's golden retriever, giggling as the dog circled her with a wagging tail. Seeing that smile on her face, I knew I had done the right thing. While Sophie showered and then played with the dog in the living room, Laura poured me a cup of hot tea. We sat at the kitchen table, and I told her everything in more detail. She listened intently, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. Amanda, you can't go back there. Not just for Sophie's sake, but for yours too. I nodded. The truth was, I had quietly been looking for a rental for months. After seeing how Sophie was treated, I started scanning classifieds and talking to coworkers who knew real estate agents. 2 weeks ago, I found a small but clean 3-bedroom house just 10 minutes from the hospital. I had already put down a deposit to hold it, planning to move in at the end of the month. But I hadn't told my parents or Sophie. I wanted to wait until everything was finalized to avoid interference or pressure. Now, that plan had to move much faster. The next morning, while Sophie was still asleep, I sat in Laura's kitchen, opened my laptop, and emailed the new landlord. I explained the situation and asked if I could move in sooner. Just an hour later, he replied, "If you're willing to pay half a month's extra rent, you can move in as early as next week." I didn't hesitate to agree. The next step was packing our things, but going back to my parents' house wouldn't be easy. I called Aunt Sarah, my mother's younger sister, who always kept her distance from family disputes but quietly supported me. When she heard my story, she paused for a moment and then said, "I'll be there this afternoon. We'll grab all the important things first." That afternoon, Aunt Sarah and I drove to my parents' house. My heart pounded as I stepped onto the porch. My mother opened the door, her expression a mix of surprise and coldness. "So, you're back. Decided to take the basement after all." I kept my voice calm. "I'm here to get my things and Sophie's. We're moving out." My father stepped out from the living room, his tone sharp. "Amanda, you're blowing this way out of proportion," Aunt Sarah cut in, her voice unusually firm. "This isn't up for debate. She needs a safe place for Sophie. We'll be quick." We went straight to Sophie's room. She stood by the door, quietly looking around at what had once been hers, now crowded with Alex's belongings. Only a small corner still held a few of her things. I swallowed the bitterness and began gathering her clothes, books, and favorite toys. Aunt Sarah packed them efficiently, avoiding unnecessary noise. As we carried the boxes to the car, Madison stood in the doorway holding Alex, a smirk half smug, half mocking.
"Good luck, sis." I didn't answer, not because I had nothing to say, but because I refused to waste any more energy on meaningless words.
Back at Laura's, Aunt Sarah and I sorted through the boxes, making a list of things we'd need to buy before moving into the new house. Sophie sat nearby, flipping through her sketchbook. She looked up and asked softly, "Will the new house have big windows, Mom? I want sunlight to paint." I smiled and nodded. "Yes, and it even has a little yard. You can plant flowers if you want." Sophie's eyes lit up. That moment made me even more certain I was on the right path, no matter how hard it might be. Follow to hear the rest, because my next step will shake the entire family. That night at Laura's, after Sophie had fallen asleep in the warm guest bed, I lay awake, unable to turn off my thoughts. Everything that had happened in the past 24 hours kept replaying in my head. The image of her suitcase by the door, Sophie's tearful eyes on the stairs, my father's icy voice reminding me I was living here for free. I knew I had escaped that house, but the hurt and anger were still raw. The next morning, I woke earlier than everyone else. Laura had already set out coffee on the kitchen counter, with a handwritten note. "Stay as long as you need. Consider this your home." I sat down, inhaling the rich aroma, and felt a small wave of relief. For the first time in months, I had woken up without the heavy dread of wondering what criticism or coldness I'd have to face that day. Laura came down to the kitchen a little later. We sat and talked, and I told her about the new house I had signed a lease for. When I mentioned the planned move-in date was next week, Laura nodded. "In that case, over the next few days, I'll help you get things organized and buy whatever else you need. And I think you should go back to your parents' place to get the rest of your things. The sooner the better." I knew she was right. Many of Sophie's belongings, from her winter clothes to her school books and personal items, were still there. But going back meant facing the whole family, and I wasn't sure I was calm enough yet to hear another word from them. That afternoon, I got a call from Aunt Sarah.
"Amanda, I think you should come with me tomorrow afternoon to get everything."
"I'll be there, so you won't have to deal with it alone." I agreed. I wanted everything done as quickly as possible, before things got more complicated. The next afternoon, we drove to my parents' house. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I saw Madison's car already parked in the garage. Tightening my grip on my handbag strap, I followed my aunt inside. My mother opened the door, her eyes showing a flicker of surprise mixed with cool detachment. "Here to get your things?" she asked, as if this were nothing more than a trivial errand. "Yes. We'll leave as soon as we're finished," I replied, keeping my voice low. When we went upstairs, Madison was sitting on the bed, Sophie's former bed, holding Alex. On the shelves, many of my daughter's things were gone, replaced with stuffed animals and brand new baby clothes.
"You came at the right time," Madison said, her tone half joking, half mocking. "I've kept a few of Sophie's things, but I don't think she really needs them." I looked her straight in the eye. "I'm taking everything."
Madison shrugged and carried Alex out. Aunt Sarah and I started packing quickly. Sophie stood in the doorway, looking around the room that no longer bore any trace of her. She didn't say a word, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. I put my hand on her shoulder. "Just a few more days, and you'll have your own room again. Big windows and plenty of sunlight." We carried the boxes down to the car. On the last trip, my father appeared in the garage doorway. "Amanda, I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this. It's just a room." I stopped, setting the box down. "Dad, it's not just a room. It's the place where my daughter felt respected. And when you moved her things into the basement without asking, you told her she didn't matter." My father frowned. "You're exaggerating." Aunt Sarah spoke up, her voice slow but steady. "David, you don't live in Sophie's skin. You don't hear what she hears, or see what she's had to endure." My father stayed silent. I lifted the box and walked to the car without looking back. That night, back at Laura's, Sophie helped me arrange the boxes neatly. She pulled out her sketchbook, opened to a fresh page, and began sketching a room with a wide window, blue curtains, and a small desk beside it. "Is this going to be my room?" I asked. "Yes, I want to put my drawings on the walls." "Okay, Mom." I smiled and nodded. In that moment, I saw a faint glimmer of hope. We were stepping into a new beginning, even if the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. Laura sat down next to me after Sophie had gone to bed. "Amanda, seeing Sophie tonight, I think she already feels lighter." I nodded. I felt it too. And I knew that to keep this peace, I had to be more steadfast than ever. That morning, as I was finishing breakfast for Sophie at Laura's, I got a call from Aunt Sarah. There was a hesitation in her voice, as if she were deciding whether or not to say something. "Amanda, I want to meet you in person. There's something important I think you need to know." We arranged to meet at a small, quiet coffee shop a few blocks from the hospital. When I arrived, she was already seated in the corner, with a thick envelope in front of her. She motioned for me to sit, her eyes more serious than I had ever seen them. "Do you remember your grandmother?" she began. "Before she passed, she left a will. In it, the house your parents live in now is jointly managed by them, but there's a special clause. If any child or grandchild in the family is treated unfairly or is forced out of the home without a valid reason, that person has the right to request the house be sold and the proceeds divided according to the terms of the will." I was stunned. "You mean I have the right to request that house be sold?" She nodded, sliding the envelope toward me. "This is a copy of the will. I've kept it since the day your grandmother died, but your parents didn't want anyone else to know. I stayed silent for years, but after hearing what happened to you and Sophie, I couldn't keep it to myself." I opened the envelope. The old pages were neatly clipped together. On the second page, the special clause stood out clearly in typewritten text, with my grandmother's signature at the bottom. I read it over and over, making sure I wasn't imagining it. "Auntie, why did Grandma write this?" I asked, my voice tight. She sighed. She knew this family had a history of favoritism. She feared that one day one of the grandchildren would be pushed out with nowhere to go. She didn't want anyone to go through that. I sat in silence, my hands gripping the papers. A wave of emotion rose in me, part aching gratitude, part the sudden spark of light breaking through darkness. For so long, I had been used to having no voice in that house. Now, for the first time, I held something that could change everything. But if I use this clause, things will get more tense than ever, I said slowly. Mom and Dad will see me as a traitor. Aunt Sarah placed her hand over mine. Amanda, sometimes protecting yourself and your daughter means accepting being misunderstood. You haven't done anything wrong. You're simply using the rights your grandmother gave you. We sat for a while longer, discussing the next steps. She advised me to meet with a lawyer to confirm the validity of the will and get guidance on how to proceed. Before leaving the cafe, she looked me straight in the eye. You have to stay calm. They won't accept this easily. But if you stand firm, you'll win. That afternoon, I met with a lawyer recommended by a colleague. The office was small, but the atmosphere was professional. After I told him the whole story and showed him the copy of the will, he nodded thoughtfully. This clause is completely legal. If it's true that you and your daughter were treated unfairly, you have the right to act on it. We'll need to gather evidence, text messages, emails, witness statements, to prove it. I immediately thought of the photos I had taken while packing our things, the messages from my mother, and the accounts from Aunt Sarah, Laura, and even a few coworkers who had seen my plans to pick up Sophie canceled because Alex needed something. How long will it? I hesitated. If we can negotiate, it could be resolved in a few months. If it goes to court, longer, the lawyer replied. But Amanda, you need to be prepared. This isn't just a legal case. It's an emotional battle within your family. I nodded. I knew that all too well, but when I remembered Sophie's face on the stairs the day her things were moved to the basement, I knew there was no turning back. That night, I sat in Laura's living room, the will spread out on the table. Sophie was drawing beside me, the warm lamplight falling over her soft hair. She looked up and asked, "Mom, where did you go today?" "I met with Aunt Sarah and someone who's going to help us," I said. "Help with the new house?" Sophie tilted her head. Smiling, I brushed her hair gently. "Help make sure people understand that you and I deserve respect too." Sophie didn't ask anything else, just nodded and went back to her drawing. I looked at the picture she was coloring. A small house with wide windows and two people standing on the porch. I realized that no matter where we were, as long as we had each other, it was home. But I also knew there were things I had to do to protect that home for the long term. The next day, I called Aunt Sarah to confirm. "Auntie, I've decided. I'm going to use the clause in the will." She didn't sound surprised. "I knew you would, and I'll stand by you." I felt a new steadiness fill me. From now on, I wasn't just a mother trying to make ends meet. I was someone ready to stand tall and defend my and my daughter's rights, even if it meant going up against my own family. What would you do if you discovered your family had hidden a will to strip you of your rights? This story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. 3 days after my conversations with Aunt Sarah and the lawyer, I decided it was time to face my parents and Madison directly. I didn't want to text or call ahead, because I knew, if I gave them time to talk, everything would get twisted and turned into an attack on me. I called Aunt Sarah to ask if she could come with me. She agreed immediately, her voice firm. "I'll be there, and this time, we'll say everything clearly without letting anyone cut us off." That afternoon, the sky was overcast, low clouds hinting at an approaching storm. When we walked into my parents' house, the whole family was already gathered around the dining table. Mom, Dad, Madison, and even Alex in a brand new high chair. The air was tight as a drawn bowstring. My father was the first to speak, his voice cold. "So, you want to talk?" I set the folder on the table. The copy of the will, the messages, the photos, and looked him straight in the eye. "Yes, I want to talk about how Sophie and I have been treated, and about the legal right my grandmother left me." Madison gave a short, mocking laugh. "Legal right? You make it sound like you're a lawyer." Aunt Sarah leaned forward, her gaze sharp. Madison let Amanda finish. I took a deep breath, opened the will, and pointed to the special clause. Grandma wrote clearly, "If any child or grandchild is treated unfairly or forced out of the home without a valid reason, that person has the right to request the house be sold and the assets divided according to the will." My mother frowned, her voice defensive. "That doesn't apply in this case." "Yes, it does, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice steady but enunciating each word. "You knew the basement was damp, you knew Sophie has asthma, but you still had her moved down there without asking me. That's not just unfair, it's dangerous to her health." My father braced his hands on the table, his tone sharp. "So you're just looking for an excuse to take the house?" "No, Dad. I'm protecting my daughter and exercising the right Grandma gave me. I never wanted it to go this far, but you left me no choice." Madison cut in, irritation in her voice. "You always act like you're the victim. This house belongs to Mom and Dad, you were just staying here." Aunt Sarah tapped the table lightly, but the sound was firm enough to break the tension. "This house is jointly owned, and this clause is legal. Amanda has the right, and if you two want to avoid going to court, you should sit down and negotiate." The room went silent. I looked at my mother. She avoided my eyes, twisting her wedding ring on her finger. After a few seconds, she spoke softly. "Do you really want to sell the house? This is where your father and I have lived for over 30 years. I swallowed. "Mom, I don't want to sell the house. I just want everyone to understand that fairness and respect are non-negotiable. But if I can't have that, I will use my right." My father raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly are you planning to do next?" I looked straight at him. "If we can't reach an agreement, I'll let my lawyer proceed. But if everyone's willing to sit down, we can find a way for Sophie and me to get our share without destroying everything." Madison shot up from her chair, pushing it back hard. "I can't believe you'd actually do this." I turned to her, my voice even. "You don't have to believe it. You just need to understand that this time, I'm not backing down." The air in the room was so heavy I could almost feel everyone's breathing. Aunt Sarah took the folder from my hands, set it in the middle of the table, and spoke slowly. "Think carefully, everyone. Amanda has evidence, a legal clause, and witnesses. If this goes to court, it won't stay within the four walls of this house." I saw my mother shiver slightly. My father stayed silent, his expression more pensive. Madison carried Alex into the living room, mumbling under her breath. I stood, giving my parents one last look before heading for the door. "I'm giving you 1 week to respond. After that, I'll let my lawyer do his job." Rain began to fall as Aunt Sarah and I stepped onto the porch. The damp earth smell filled my lungs, cold, but sharper than anything I'd felt in months. I knew that after today, nothing would ever be the same, and I had officially stepped into a battle I could not, and would not, walk away from. A week after that confrontation, I got a call from my mother on Monday morning. Her voice was tired, quieter than usual.
Amanda? Could you come for dinner tonight?
Your father and I want to talk. I paused for a few seconds before agreeing. I knew this could be a turning point, either to negotiate or to ignite another round of arguments. That evening, I left Sophie at Laura's, not wanting her to face any more pressure. When I walked into the dining room, my parents and Madison were already seated. The atmosphere was different from the week before, less tense, but still with an undercurrent of caution. My father started. "We've thought about this a lot. I don't want our family dragged into court, but I also don't want to sell the house." I nodded, saying nothing, waiting for him to continue. My mother jumped in. If you agree, your father and I will give you a sum from our savings. It'll match the value of your share under the will, in exchange for you withdrawing your request to sell the house. I glanced at Aunt Sarah, who had been sitting quietly in the corner like a neutral observer. She gave a slight nod, as if to remind me this was a time to listen, but also to hold my ground. I need a specific number, I said. And everything must be in writing, signed off by the lawyer. Madison frowned. You don't trust the family enough to skip the paperwork? I turned to her, my voice calm but sharp enough. Trust is built on respect. When my daughter and I were sent to the basement without a word, that trust was broken. The room went silent for a moment. My father sighed. This money will come from our retirement savings, plus part of what Madison will repay from an earlier loan. Madison spun toward him in protest. I told you I'd pay that back over time. Why now? My father cut her off. Madison, this is the way to end it. Everyone has to give a little. I couldn't help but notice the bitterness in those words. For years, give had always been my responsibility, never Madison's. But this time, the balance had shifted. We sat down at the desk in the living room, laying out the will and a blank sheet of paper. I wrote out the terms, the amount, the transfer deadline, a promise not to interfere in my and Sophie's lives, and a clear statement that all my rights under the will would remain if the terms were broken. My parents read it carefully, then nodded. Madison reluctantly signed the section acknowledging she would repay part to cover my share. When it was all done, I felt part of the weight lift from my shoulders. I hadn't won outright. The house was still theirs, but Sophie and I had secured enough value to start an independent life. More importantly, I'd forced them to acknowledge the unfairness that had happened. The next step was finalizing the lease for our new place. The landlord, after hearing a brief outline of my situation, agreed to let me have the keys a week early. I spent the next day with Laura and Aunt Sarah cleaning and moving things from Laura's garage. When Sophie stepped into her new room for the first time, she ran straight to the big window and flung the curtains open. The golden afternoon light poured in, casting a warm glow on the walls. She turned and hugged me tightly. Mom, I love this room. I smiled, feeling a peace I hadn't known in months. I knew this space would be where she regained the confidence she'd lost, where we could both breathe without tiptoeing around anyone. In the days that followed, life began to settle. Sophie went back to practicing piano without anyone complaining. I bought her a new bookshelf and got myself a small desk in the living room corner. Laura often stopped by with fresh baked pies or potted flowers for the front porch. My parents began calling to check in, their tone softer now, though the distance was still there. I didn't rush to close that gap. Trust, as I'd told Madison, takes time and respect to rebuild. One evening, as Sophie and I were making dinner together, she asked, Mom, are Grandma and Grandpa still mad at us? I set down the knife and looked at her. Maybe they don't fully understand yet, but I believe someday they'll see that what matters most is fairness and kindness. Sophie nodded, then smiled. I just want to be here with you. I pulled her into my arms, realizing that while this battle had drained me, the outcome was worth every bit of it. We had gained what I'd dreamed of for 2 years, a home of our own, and the right to live with the respect we deserved. If you've ever had to stand up to injustice in your own family, share your story. It might inspire someone else. That spring came faster than I expected. On the first warm days, Sophie started planting little flower pots on the porch steps, proudly showing me each new sprout. I spent my free afternoons repainting old furniture, turning our rental into a warm, personal space for the two of us. One Saturday morning, as I was making coffee in the kitchen, Sophie ran in holding a cream-colored envelope. Mom, a letter from school, she said, eyes sparkling. I wiped my hands and opened it. Inside was a notice that Sophie had been selected for the school's special art group, a program for students with exceptional creative potential. I looked at her, pride and emotion swelling in me. You did it, Sophie. I knew you would. She grinned, cheeks flushed, and hugged me suddenly. I think, if we'd stayed at Grandma and Grandpa's, I never would have been chosen. Her words caught in my throat. She was right. A child's surroundings shape them more than we realize. Since leaving the old house, Sophie had slowly regained her laughter, her confidence, and her joy in the little things. One afternoon, my mother called asking to visit. At first I hesitated, but then decided maybe it was time to open a new conversation. When she arrived, Sophie and I were prepping dinner. She stood at the door, pausing before stepping in. "Your home is beautiful, Amanda," she said, her eyes taking in every detail. "You've done more than I thought you could." I smiled, ignoring the comparison, and invited her to sit. Over dinner, she spoke of old memories with Grandma and of the pressures she'd felt raising two children. "Maybe I was too hard on you," she said slowly, as if the words were heavy. "I didn't realize it made you feel abandoned." I set my chopsticks down and looked her in the eye. "Mom, I don't need you to apologize for the past. But I need you to understand that love and respect can't be built on comparisons. Sophie needs that more than anything." She nodded, and for the first time in years, I saw her eyes soften. Over time, my relationship with my parents became easier. They no longer interfered in my life, and when they visited, they seemed genuinely interested in Sophie. Madison kept her distance, but I accepted that. Not every wound heals, and I no longer wanted to exhaust myself patching gaps that had been there too long. What I focused on was our future. The money from the settlement with my parents, plus my savings and steady income, allowed me to start looking for a small home to buy. It took months, but I finally found one I loved. 3 bedrooms, a backyard big enough for Sophie to grow flowers, and for me to set up an outdoor reading nook. On the day I signed the papers, I quietly took a photo holding the keys. When I handed them to Sophie, she squealed, "So, this is really our forever home?" "Yes, sweetheart. This is where we'll stay. A place where you can draw, play music, and do anything you want without anyone telling you to stop." She hugged me, and I realized that moment was the greatest reward for everything I'd endured. That summer, we hosted a small housewarming party. Laura brought apple pie, Aunt Sarah brought pots of lavender, and a few coworkers from the hospital came too. Even my parents showed up with a large fruit basket. No one brought up the past, but when I saw my mother standing by the fence, watching Sophie play in the yard and smiling, I knew she understood, at least partly, why I had once been so determined to leave. That night, after everyone left, I sat on the porch steps, watching Sophie's bedroom light glow through the window. I thought back to those first days leaving my parents' home, full of fear and uncertainty. Now looking back, I saw that every step, no matter how hard, had led me here. I whispered to myself, "This is home. This is peace." Most importantly, I'd given my daughter a lesson I never learned as a child, that your worth doesn't depend on someone else's approval, and sometimes, to truly live, you have to leave the place you once called home when it's no longer safe. What would you do if you were in my position? Would you have the courage to walk away from a house that was only the shadow of safety, to start over from nothing like I did? For me, this journey wasn't just about breaking free. It was about finding back our laughter, our peace, and our trust. Every family has stories outsiders can't see, but sometimes the brave choice is the only way to hold on to your self-worth. If you've ever been through or witnessed something like this, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you'd like to keep following along and hear more honest stories about family, loss, and healing, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's